I'm going to try to take you back 100 years to Providence 100 years ago. Now, that's a little bit different than we usually talk about in committee meetings. I obviously realize that. But 100 years ago, the city of Providence was in a very difficult position with regard to water. We had cholera in the city of Providence. And the Hope High School of today was on a reservoir in Providence. And what we know as Sockanosset Place in Cranston was another reservoir. And by the way, the city of Providence had to pay taxes to the city of Cranston. But cholera was raging. And Providence, for 25 years prior to that, had been going to the General Assembly and asking for permission to clean up its water. Finally, in 1915, the state allowed and in fact mandated the city of Providence to create a water purity system. And that included, for all practical purposes, a condemnation power that allowed Providence to condemn a substantial portion of the town of Scituate. Now, that project was delayed by the First World War, but by 1926, the project was basically completed and water started to pump out of the Scituate Reservoir. Prior to that, they still had cholera in the city of Providence, if you can believe it. That's because of the impure drinking sources. So in 1926, pure water started to come. And Providence ran it. Providence ran it. Nobody else was involved. And all of the rates that were involved at that point in time were implemented by the city of Providence. Now, the city of Providence went out 15 times in bond issues, general obligation bond issues, to complete the system as we now know it. 15 times. The general obligation bond, as you are well aware, means that the city is responsible. The city is responsible. It's not a revenue bond where only the ratepayers, in this case, would in fact be responsible. So the city has a history. As a matter of fact, until 1980, the PUC had no jurisdiction over Providence water. And you maybe remember back in the late 70s and 80s, there was a number of political things happening in the city that others outside the city, particularly the PUC, had some issues with. And it started a process under which the PUC and the city were, in fact, in many cases, in conflict. They simply didn't agree as to rates. They didn't agree as to what the city should receive for those rates. They didn't agree on the capitalization rates or, in fact, bond issues at that point in time. Now, but the city is on the hook, general obligation bonds. Now, you will recall last year we had some testimony about who owns the Scituate Reservoir. And, you know, one thing about history, it's just there. And in fact, for the lawyers here, we all pay attention to what our Rhode Island Supreme Court says about issues. And let me just read you a couple of cautionary thoughts from two cases involving the Scituate Reservoir. The first is an old case, the Joslin Manufacturing case. And specifically, the court acknowledges that the title to the property condemned shall vest in the city of Providence in fee simple. Let me just repeat that. Okay? The title to the property condemned shall vest in the city as fee simple. Now, we're talking about a substantial part of Scituate, as you are all aware. Now, with that acquisition authority comes great responsibilities, including financial responsibilities. And in the subsequent case, the court said, Providence is solely liable for all the takings. And then it's went on to say further in another case that the right to take and receive water from the city of systems, none of the communities were obligated to pay for any portion of the reservoir except their own connected piping. Instead, Providence bore all the costs of the reservoir. And in fact, in that particular case, they went through all the various costs that were involved. And quite frankly, it's pretty remarkable that that could happen. Now, again, they went out from time to issue bonds to pay for the water system. And in many cases, those bonds mean that the city shares the entire cost. Now, later on, we had the Clean Water Authority, and that has spread cost among other bond issues that are going out from the state of Rhode Island. But in those days, it was clearly all Providence. So every time I hear about, you know, Providence does not own the Scituate Reservoir, I just have to go back to Rhode Island Supreme Court cases, and there it is, black and white, fee simple, end of story. And it makes the point also that while other people had the right to withdraw water given to them by the statute, that in fact, that's all it was. That's all it was. It was the right to withdraw water. And that's limited to 4 communities. So it's a very clear issue that sometimes gets misinterpreted because we are all ratepayers. Everybody pays rates for their water. And the question is, Is it equitable for those ratepayers to have some interest in the event of a transaction that the mayor has been talking about? And you can make arguments about that, but the bottom line is, city owns it. The city owns it. If you're at a community outside of the city and you've had pipes that you've had for years and years and the water flows through it, well, it's Providence water that flows through your pipes. But the system is still the Providence system. And some people also forget, I know you wouldn't forget, but they kind of forget that the water board is an integral part of the city of Providence. The city of Providence and the water board are one for that purpose. So every time I hear the story about, well, the ratepayers have an interest, I understand they have an interest. The question is, what interest do they have? But they don't have an interest in Scituate. They just don't have one. And let me just address another issue that comes up all the time, and that it relates to a comment made in 1980 in the course of a PUC decision. I think it was it's later than that, 1988. And what happened was the city of Providence went to the PUC, was then regulated by the PUC, and it asked for a number of things, including to have additional protection in terms of the rate base for things such as insurance and what happens if there was a disaster, all kinds of issues like that they thought they should, in fact, have some stability from, not just relating from the ratepayers themselves. And there was some testimony on that, and in the course of that testimony, it came from the Division of Public Utilities, did not come from the city. And there was no issue raised as to who owns what. But the comment was that it says something like this: it appears that ratepayers have a substantial interest in the water supply system. That is the entire statement. And every time we talk about the PUC talking about ratepayers, that's it. That is it. There is nothing else out there in all of the PUC decisions that we've gone through to determine whether the PUC ever made a finding about who owns what. The answer is they have not done so. And I would hope that that would be important to understand in terms of these fee simple arrangements, the leasing arrangements, and the other possibilities here for leasing that the mayor has talked about. In summary, by operation of law and by Supreme Court decisions, the city acquired a fee simple ownership in what is our ownership in Scituate and the Providence water supply system. By the way, if someone is here from Scituate, they know that a substantial portion of the taxes are paid by the city of Providence through the ratepayers now, but initially through the city of Providence. Now the ratepayers do pay that as part of our general cost of operation, but for years that was all from the city of Providence. And the city shouldered not only the costs and expenses of purchasing the land and took the chance that something could go wrong with that engineering, which is what they did, but they purchased the land through condemnation. They owned the land through condemnation. They did all the original costs, all of the bonds all of the dikes and everything else that we utilized at that time, all Providence, from general obligation bonds of Providence. So I think it's important when we talk about these equities, let's remember what it is. It's like, if I can use an example, it's like you own a house and you decide to rent the house. Somebody occupies the house and they have use. They have use of the house. You may end up with a deal where they pay the taxes. They pay rental. They may pay maintenance costs and whatnot, but you still own the house. It doesn't go away. And that's the fundamental issue that is facing people who talk about this in terms of the ratepayers. It's who owns the house. That's, in my mind, the way to think about it. So I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. I know it's a brief historical record, but it's important for you to understand. Yes,
Thank
Senator,
you.
I'm sorry.
Any questions or comments for Mr. Partridge? Thank you. Mr. Friday?